I still remember the day my divorce was finalized because it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like being erased from my own life, while everyone else kept talking as if I was already gone. Jason looked me in the eyes and told me I would never survive without him. And my parents didn't argue. They just nodded like he had finally said out loud what they had been thinking for years. That night, I went home alone to a house that suddenly felt too big, too quiet, too empty, as if even the walls had already decided I didn't belong there anymore. And what hurt the most wasn't the divorce itself, it was the way my name stopped being mentioned in family conversations, like I had become a mistake they didn't want to repeat out loud. Before this story continues, if this moment speaks to your heart even a little, take a second to like and subscribe, only if this story truly resonates with you, and I would love to know where you're watching from, your city or country, and what time it is where you are right now. My name is Emily Carter. I am 34 years old, and this is the night my life stopped being what everyone thought it was, even though none of them realized it yet. At the time, my family believed the divorce had proven them right, that I had failed at the one thing they thought defined a woman's worth. But what they didn't know was that silence is not collapse. Sometimes silence is preparation. I remember sitting in my small apartment that first week after everything ended, staring at a coffee mug that had my initials faded on the side, realizing no one was going to call to check on me. Not my mother, not my sister, not even Jason, who once promised I would never be alone. Days turned into weeks, and I became something they no longer needed to see. A name that didn't appear on invitations, a seat that was never reserved, a voice that was no longer expected at family tables. My sister once said, without even trying to hide her smile, that I had chosen a life of failure, and my mother never corrected her. But what they all missed was that I stopped asking to be understood. I started rebuilding in ways they would never notice, taking late-night work shifts, learning skills I had once been told were not for someone like me, and slowly stepping into rooms where my last name meant nothing. Months passed like that, quiet and invisible, until the day an envelope arrived at my door, thick, formal, and completely unexpected. There was no return explanation, only my name printed at the top in bold letters, followed by words I had never seen associated with me before. Featured honoree. It was an invitation to a corporate gala in Chicago, one that my family would later call impossible when they finally saw it. I remember holding that envelope for a long time before opening it, because something about it felt like it didn't belong to the version of me they still believed in. And when I finally unfolded it, I didn't just see my name. I saw the beginning of something they were never meant to understand, because the truth behind that invitation didn't start with success. It started with the moment I disappeared from everything they thought they knew about me, and what happened in those missing months is the one thing they were never prepared to find out. I used to think becoming invisible in my own family was normal, because I grew up inside a home where attention was never distributed equally. It was assigned like a privilege I was never qualified to receive. My sister always had the better seat at the table, the first slice of birthday cake, the louder applause for even the smallest achievement, while I learned to wait for silence that never really turned into acknowledgement. I remember one specific Sunday dinner when I was around 12. Now, my sister talked about a school award she had received, and my mother immediately stood up to hug her, while I quietly mentioned I had been selected for an academic program at school, and my father only nodded without looking up from his plate, saying that was fine for now. That word stayed with me more than any celebration ever could, because it meant my efforts were never something to be proud of, only something to tolerate. As I grew older, the pattern never changed. My sister's mistakes were softened into lessons, while mine were turned into proof that I was too serious or not easy to understand. And even when I tried to match expectations, it always felt like I was arriving in a race that had already ended without me. Jason entered my life during what I thought was my escape from all of that. And for a while, I believed marriage would finally reset the balance I had never experienced at home. But instead, it slowly became another place where I learned to shrink myself, to avoid speaking too loudly, to avoid being inconvenient, until eventually silence replaced conversation altogether. When the divorce happened, I expected pain, but I did not expect recognition from my family in the worst possible way, as if my failure had finally proven something they had always suspected about me. My mother once told me on the phone that I had always been too independent for my own good, and my sister added later in a message that independence just meant I was difficult to love, and I remember reading that message longer than I should have, not because it hurt me for the first time, but because it confirmed a pattern I had been ignoring for years. After the divorce, I stopped participating in family conversations entirely, not out of anger, but because I realized I was only ever included when I could be compared, never when I could be understood, and over time I began building a life that required no permission from them. I took extra shifts, learned new professional skills at night, and started accepting projects that no one in my circle thought I was qualified for, not because I was trying to prove anything to them, but because I finally understood that survival sometimes begins where approval ends. The first time I noticed something shifting was not dramatic, it was subtle, like receiving an email response from someone I did not expect to notice me at all, or being invited to a meeting where my name was listed without hesitation. And slowly, those small moments began forming a pattern that did not match the version of me my family still believed in. I did not tell them anything about it because I was still learning how to exist without their interpretation of my life. But one afternoon, while reviewing an unexpected professional inquiry connected to a large corporate event in Chicago, I realized that the space I had been quietly stepping into was no longer small or temporary, and that something I had built in silence was about to become impossible for them to ignore. The shift did not happen all at once. It happened through a story that my family decided to believe before I even had the chance to respond to it. It started with a single message that I never sent, at least not the way they later described it. Jason told them I had left the marriage because I was overwhelmed, unstable, and unable to handle responsibility, and somehow that version of events traveled faster than anything I could have said in my own defense. I still remember opening my phone one morning and seeing a group chat that I had not been active in for weeks, filled with messages that were already treating my absence like confirmation. My sister wrote that she always knew I would not last, that I was too emotional for real commitment, and my mother replied with a single line saying she hoped I would figure myself out before it was too late. No one asked me directly what happened, because the story they had accepted did not require my input anymore. A week later, I received an email attachment forwarded by my father, a scanned note that Jason claimed I had written, stating that I wanted to step away from the pressure of family expectations and marriage responsibilities. But I stared at it for a long time because I had never written those words, not even once, and the phrasing felt strangely polished, too neat for something emotional I would have said in real life. When I called Jason to ask him about it, he did not deny anything. He only said that people needed closure, and that sometimes closure required helpful framing, and then he ended the call before I could respond. That was the moment I realized the lie was no longer just between us. It had become something my entire family was reorganizing their understanding around. The next day, my mother told a relative that I had left because I could not handle being a wife, and by the end of the week, I was no longer being asked where I was or how I was doing. I was being described as if I had already been fully understood and judged. I stopped trying to correct it after the third conversation, because every correction only made the version of me they believed in feel more solid to them, not less. Instead, I focused on work, answering emails late at night, taking on responsibilities that slowly expanded beyond what I had been given before, until I found myself involved in a project that required approval from a senior executive team based in Chicago. I did not think much of it at first, just another assignment I would handle quietly. But then one afternoon, a formal document arrived in my inbox, confirming attendance at a private corporate gala, and when I opened the attached invitation file, my breath stopped for a moment, because my name was not just listed among attendees, it was placed at the top of the featured guest section, as if I had already been recognized for something I had not even been allowed to explain yet. That was when I understood that the story my family had been repeating about me was about to collide with something they had never seen coming, and everything they believed they knew was about to break at the exact same moment. The days after the invitation arrived were not peaceful. They were strangely loud in a way I could not fully explain, because silence from my family had turned into something heavier than rejection. It had become active avoidance. At first, I thought they would eventually call me, maybe to confirm the details or to ask questions they were too proud to ask directly. But instead, the opposite happened. They started reaching out in fragments, indirect message, and carefully worded attempts that still carried the same old judgment underneath. My mother sent a short email saying she had heard confusing things and wanted me to clarify what I was doing with my life, but there was no apology, only curiosity shaped like concern. My sister left a voicemail that sounded almost rehearsed, telling me that if I was going through something difficult, I should come back to reality before making more mistakes, as if I had simply wandered off into confusion instead of building anything real. Jason, however, was the most persistent in his own quiet way, sending me a message late one night saying people were asking about me, and it might be better if I explained myself before things got out of hand. But what struck me most was that none of them ever mentioned the invitation directly, as if acknowledging it would force them to confront something they were not ready to understand. I remember sitting at my small kitchen table, reading those messages one by one, feeling less hurt each time, not because the words were kinder, but because they were starting to feel distant, like they were describing a version of me that no longer existed in the same way. The first time I ignored a call from my mother without feeling the need to call back immediately, I realized something had changed inside me, not dramatically, but quietly, like a door closing that I had spent years leaving slightly open. A few days later, a handwritten letter arrived at my apartment, my father's name on the return address, something he had never done before, and inside, he wrote that he was willing to talk things through if I stopped being difficult and returned to a reasonable conversation. But there was no acknowledgement of the invitation, no recognition of what it meant, only a request for me to return to a version of myself that fit their narrative. I did not respond. Instead, I kept working, attending meetings, preparing for responsibilities that were growing more serious by the week, and I noticed that my focus had shifted from being understood to being precise, from explaining myself to simply delivering results. One evening, I received another email confirming final details for the corporate gala in Chicago, including a private seating arrangement and a formal recognition segment, and for the first time I did not feel the need to share it with anyone from my past. I remember closing my laptop that night and sitting in silence for a long time, realizing that I was no longer waiting for them to call, no longer waiting for them to believe me, and in that moment, something irreversible happened. I stopped trying to be seen through their eyes, and started preparing for a moment where they would have no choice but to see me as I actually was. After I stopped responding to my family, my life did not fall apart the way they expected. Instead, it became quieter, sharper, and strangely more intentional, like every hour finally belonged to me without permission or explanation. I moved through my days with a kind of discipline I had never experienced before, working longer shifts, accepting responsibilities that stretched my abilities, and learning to make decisions without waiting for someone to approve my existence first. At work, I was no longer the person trying to prove she belonged. I was simply the person who delivered results, who stayed late when others left, who solved problems without announcing it. And over time, that silence became my strength. I remember one morning walking into the office and noticing a new nameplate placed on my desk, not because I asked for it, but because my role had quietly changed. The letters engraved clean and simple with my full name, Emily Carter, Project Lead. I stood there for a moment just looking at it, not because it was grand, but because it felt real in a way my family's approval never had. No one clapped, no one called it out, it simply existed, and that was enough. Weeks passed like that, structured, steady, and increasingly distant from the life I used to explain to people who never truly listened. I started traveling occasionally for work, short trips to Chicago and nearby cities, always economy flights, always packed with notes and preparation, never with announcements or expectations, and somewhere along those trips I realized I had stopped imagining what my family would say about my progress, because their voices no longer fit into the future I was building. One evening after returning from a meeting, I received a final confirmation email regarding the corporate gala, this time including a formal itinerary, seating chart, and a note indicating that I would be introduced during the recognition segment. At the bottom of the document, there was a simple line confirming my name placement on stage materials, and I remember tracing that line with my eyes for a long time, understanding that this was not something temporary or accidental. It was recognition built on work they had never seen me do. That night, I packed a small black dress and a single pair of heels, nothing extravagant, just something appropriate for a room I had never been part of before, and I noticed that I did not feel nervous, only clear. As I closed my suitcase, I thought about the last conversation I had with my mother, the unanswered calls, the letters, the silence that followed, and I realized I had not thought about responding in days. The version of me that once waited for forgiveness had quietly disappeared, replaced by someone who no longer needed permission to move forward. And as I sat by the window that night, looking at the city lights outside my apartment, I understood something simple but irreversible had happened. I was no longer trying to return to who they thought I was. I was already becoming someone they had never taken the time to recognize, and the moment they would finally see it was already on its way, waiting in Chicago, in a room I had not yet entered, where everything I had built in silence was about to be revealed. I do not remember the exact moment everything became peaceful, but I do remember the moment I stopped waiting for my family to define who I was. Life did not suddenly become perfect after Chicago. It became real in a different way, quieter, more honest, and no longer shaped by people who only remembered me when I fit their narrative. The night of the corporate gala, I arrived early, standing just outside a set of tall glass doors where names I used to only read about were now printed alongside mine on the guest list. I did not feel like I was stepping into a different world. I felt like I was finally stepping out of the one where I had always been misread. When I entered the room, nothing dramatic happened at first, just the natural hum of conversations, glasses being placed on tables, people greeting each other with familiarity earned over years I had not been part of. Then I saw them. My mother, my sister, and Jason were already seated among invited guests, not because they expected to see me, but because they had been invited through separate professional connections tied to the same event. For a moment, none of them noticed me. I stayed still, not hiding, not announcing myself, just standing in a space where I no longer felt small. It was Jason who saw me first. His expression shifted in a way that was not loud, but deeply unsettled, like a memory colliding with something he could not easily categorize anymore. My mother turned next, and I saw the exact second her eyes moved from recognition to confusion, and then to something quieter, something that looked almost like disbelief trying not to become understanding. My sister did not smile. She simply stared, as if she was waiting for me to explain how I got there. As if my presence required permission to exist in that space. No one approached me immediately. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic interruption. Instead, there was distance, and in that distance, the truth settled itself more clearly than any argument could have done. When my name was called to the stage, I walked forward without hesitation. The room did not change for me, but the way I stood in it did. I spoke briefly, only about the work, the team, and the project that brought me there, nothing personal, nothing about the past, because I no longer felt the need to translate my life into something they could validate. When I stepped down, I did not look for their reaction, but I felt it anyway, the silence that follows when someone no longer fits the version you built in your mind. Later, as the evening slowed and conversations resumed around me, my mother finally approached. She did not accuse me, she did not congratulate me either. She simply said she did not understand when everything changed. I told her the truth without raising my voice. I said it changed the moment I stopped waiting to be understood. My sister did not speak to me that night, but I saw her watching from across the room, no longer with certainty, but with questions she had never needed to ask before. Jason tried to approach once, but stopped halfway, as if realizing there was nothing familiar left to reach for. I left before the event ended, not because I was leaving them, but because I was choosing myself without needing to announce it. Outside, the Chicago air was cold, steady, and clear, and for the first time, I felt no pull backward. There was no victory in the emotional sense they would recognize, no revenge, no collapse on their side, only distance, and the understanding that distance itself had become my boundary. In that moment, I understood something simple but permanent. You do not always heal by being seen correctly. Sometimes you heal by no longer needing to be seen at all. I am Emily Carter. I am 34 years old. And if there is one thing this journey taught me, it is that your worth does not become real when others finally notice it. It was always real, even when they refused to look. If you are watching this and you feel unseen, misunderstood, or defined by someone else's version of you, I want you to know that your silence can become your rebuilding, not your ending. Protect your peace, protect your time, and protect your sense of self even when it feels easier to explain yourself again and again. Not everyone will understand your growth, and that is something you are allowed to outgrow. Sometimes I still think about how long I waited for validation that was never coming, and I wish I had known earlier that walking away from that waiting is not giving up, it is choosing freedom. If this story reached you, if it made you pause even for a moment, I am grateful you stayed until the end. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here, and if you ever feel alone in your own story, remember you are not the only one learning how to start again. Maybe there is something larger than us guiding these moments, something that redirects us when we stay too long where we are not valued, and maybe that is enough to keep going. Emily Carter, 34 years old, and the message I want to leave you with is this. Do not let anyone define your ending while you are still writing your beginning. If you would like to hear more stories like this, you can stay with this space, because there are always more voices learning how to begin again, and maybe the next one will feel a little like your own.